Thank you. It's actually great to be back at Access in Saskatoon. This was something of a nostalgia trip for me because Access 98 was in fact the first Access conference I ever attended those many years ago. In making that remark, however, I'm not just subjecting you to my personal nostalgia. I'm actually setting up a segue to my first slide. Let's see if that works. 3 months or so after Access 98, the Council on Library and Information Resources released a report by Jeff Rothenberg entitled Avoiding Technological Quicksand, Finding a Viable Technical Foundation for Digital Preservation. In it, he considered a number of approaches to the problem of keeping bits readable in perpetuity. So, hard copy, print everything out. Standards, rely on baseline standards to forward migrate data across generations of software applications. Computer museums, preserve the original hardware along with the software and the data in order to experience the digital artifact in its pristine originality. Format migration, update file formats to modern equivalents, whatever those are. And emulation, so reinstantiate obsolete computing environments in software so that you can actually run old operating systems and old software on modern hardware with a layer of software called the emulator in between to kind of translate the system calls between the one and the other. However, ultimately, Rothenberg argued that all but emulation would be of limited utility. Emulation was, he thought, the only way to ensure the longevity of digital data in a scalable, practical way. The only other serious contender, which he identified as format migration, was seen to pose too great a risk of data loss and changes to both formatting and functionality, as well as being unsuitable for preserving more complex digital artifacts, such as software, games, and artworks. This position was not without its detractors. A couple of months after the CLIR report, David Behrman published an article in DLib called Reality and Chimeras in the Preservation of Electronic Records, making the bold statement that computer scientists believe emulation is very likely to never be viable, which is a bit bizarre since functioning emulators predate Behrman's paper by about 30 years. That aside, however, Behrman's central argument was that emulation is actually unlikely to fill the evidentiary requirements of records managers and archivists, whereas format migration could actually fulfill that function. I can't go into the details why. Whatever the ultimate merits of that argument, format migration, or sometimes known as normalization, has in fact since become the dominant methodology, I would say, in the archival community, formalized in the OAIS standard and software implementing that standard, such as Archivematica. However, Rothenberg's arguments weren't entirely without merit. Emulation-based approaches are still very much in play these days, most visibly in Jason Scott's amazing software preservation work at the Internet Archive. But also in other places too, as described in this recent article from Code for Lib and this white paper from Cornell about digital art objects. For me, it's interesting looking back on this debate from the vantage point of nearly 20 years on, and particularly in light of some of the content recovery projects that I've been working on over the last couple of years. And while I think actually Rothenberg made better arguments overall than Behrman did, the reality is that the only approach that I haven't made use of is printing everything out in hard copy. In my particular area of interest, which is to say recovering digital content from the 1980s and early 90s, hardware preservation, standards, format migration, and emulation all have their uses, mostly in combination with each other. It's not actually a case of picking the one true strategy. It's very much more a case of whatever works, as I hope that the following case studies will illustrate. So, last year I had a researcher approach me about getting access to some things he had written 25 years ago on his old Atari, using some word processing software called, appropriately enough, Atari Writer. Although it's easy enough to read data off of 5¼ floppies if you have the technology, there is no modern software that I'm aware of that can read or convert Atari Writer files. However, one of the things you do learn fairly early on when you're doing this kind of thing is that if you could play games on an old platform, somebody has probably written an emulator for it. And the Atari was, in fact, a pretty big gaming platform back in its day. So it was relatively straightforward to locate, install, and configure an open source Atari emulator called Atari 800. I didn't in this case have to track down the Atari Writer software, as the researcher I was helping out still actually had his own original copy. But in general, I think it's fair to observe that tracking down old software is not actually that difficult in most cases, although the legality is somewhat uncertain. Purely speculatively, I think it's possible that making copies of abandonware for the purposes of research and private study might be covered off under fair dealing, but I'm not a lawyer, and I don't think that's ever been tested in court. So, here's the document as it appears in Atari Writer. And while it's possible to declare the problem solved at this point, Rothenberg is vindicated, emulation works, hurrah. The reality is that in most cases you don't actually want to have to read these old documents in this form, because it means fiddling about with the emulator, the Atari interface, and the Atari Writer interface every time you want to look at these documents, which is it's more overhead than most people want to deal with. And you also have to be careful that you're not actually modifying the contents while you're doing it. So fortunately, it's possible to configure the Atari 800 emulator to bridge the printing output from the Atari operating system to the host operating system. Remember this under emulation, which enabled us to print out the researchers' Atari Writer documents as PDFs. All of which illustrates that even if you think that format migration is in fact the best way to go, sometimes the only way to get there is via emulation. WordStar is one common case that you're likely to encounter when you start working with digital content from the early 80s. It was the best-selling word processor of its era, and lots of people used it. Despite that, there are no really good open-source format converters for it, and no modern word processing application, such as MS Word or LibreOffice, can open WordStar files. There is an ancient conversion utility floating around for Word, which may still work, but I've had kind of imperfect results from it. So what are the options here? Well, as it turns out, just reading old WordStar documents is not very difficult. There are lots of options available using approaches kind of similar to what I was talking about with Atari Writer, so I'm just going to kind of skip past this slide, which shows a WordStar document open in WordPerfect 12 in Windows 2000 running in VirtualBox. Instead, I'm going to focus on a different aspect of the problem, which is what do you do when you've got hundreds or even thousands of these documents? This is not at all uncommon if you are dealing with someone's personal archives. So opening these files one by one and converting them by hand is rather tedious if you've got a lot of them to do. So some document formats have batch conversion tools available, but batch converters for WordStar are surprisingly scarce. One approach here is to fall back on standards, namely one of the most ancient and venerable standards, 7-bit ASCII, which is how WordStar files were saved natively or kind of almost. To get a bit technical, many versions of WordStar deviated from the ASCII standard by setting the unused 8th bit of the 7-bit ASCII standard to denote the end of a word, which makes the last character of each word unintelligible in any modern text editor, as illustrated here. You can kind of read it like this, but fortunately, it's actually really, really easy to script a conversion tool. Here's an example in Perl. Just wrap a bit more code around that, and you can run it as a batch job over many, many files at once. Of course, down conversion to ASCII isn't perfect. You do lose some formatting, but as a quick and dirty way to open up WordStar files for inspection, or even more importantly for string searching, it works pretty well. If you find any files you're interested in, then maybe you can do the full-on conversion to see what they actually looked like. Most of those old files actually didn't have much in the way of formatting, particularly if you're dealing with someone's correspondence or personal papers and that kind of stuff. It's the same text after conversion. My third and final case study delves deep into the realms of the obscure. I don't know if you thought we were there already, but we're going deeper. Those of you who were at Access 2015 in Toronto may remember a presentation I did on restoring some old computer graphics developed in a little-known technology called Teledon, which later evolved into a standard called NAPLIPS. The North American presentation level protocol syntax. If you've got a really good memory, you might also remember that although I had some initial success with an emulation-based approach for those images, I had subsequently come across a few hundred more files in the archive that didn't seem to work very well in my emulator, and I wasn't sure what to do with them, and that's kind of where the presentation ended. Well, it turned out that these problem files had been developed in an earlier version of the standard called Teledon 699. And Teledon 699 graphics dates so far back that consumer-grade computers were not actually powerful enough to render them natively. Instead, specialized hardware peripherals were developed for the sole purpose of rendering Teledon images. And given the, sorry, is that 5 minutes till 15 or 5 minutes till the end? Okay, thank you. Thought I was going to have to start talking even more quickly. Okay, good. So we're down to the kind of specialized hardware here, right? Specialized peripherals were used with dedicated circuitry and embedded logic for the sole purpose of rendering Teledon images. And given the ultimate failure of Teledon to gain any traction in the marketplace, very few of these things were made, and they're almost impossible to track down now. But they're actually the only way to make these graphics intelligible in the modern day, short of actually going back to the original standard and writing a decoder from scratch, which would be an insane amount of work. However, thanks to a large amount of luck, I was eventually able to locate a functioning Teledon 699 decoder in the collection of the volunteer-run Spark Radio Museum in Coquitlam, which is just outside of Vancouver. And even more miraculously, it actually came accompanied by a brilliant volunteer, a guy named Brent Hilpert, who was able to get it hooked up to a modern computer and fix it when it blew capacitors. It's a bad video shot on my iPhone showing one of the Teledon images rendering on the decoder. Of course, even once we had the ability to view the images, we still had the question of how to record them for posterity. The 35-year-old decoder was somewhat flaky and brittle, as I've kind of already indicated, and relying on its continued existence didn't seem like the best option for ensuring the longevity of this work. So as you can kind of probably make out from the video, these aren't actually static images either. You need a moving image format to capture some of their unique rendering qualities. So the conversion to something like MP4 seemed to be the way forward here. But how to transfer the images across generations of technology? We wind up going old school, actually recording directly off the CRT using a video camera, which is similar to how the original Teledon artists actually used to record their works back in the 80s. You can see here we actually had the cover off the decoder, and we were blowing air across it with a fan to keep it from overheating. Okay, so this is a small sample of the result. That's the introductory frame to a Teledon series by the artist Glenn Howarth. What this is another format migration project, but in this case it's one that was absolutely and unavoidably dependent on access to some very obscure period hardware. Right. There's more of that. More of that sequence is available on the web. I could actually post that to the Twitter afterwards if anybody's interested. Before we leave the subject, 2 minutes, great. This is my last substantive slide. Before we leave the subject of hardware preservation, there's one last point I'd like to make, which is even if we all agree that hardware preservation is kind of hard to do and doesn't scale, there's still one area where we can't get away from it, and that's reading old media, right? Someone gives you a box of old floppy disks, you aren't going to get very far unless you have a drive to read them with, and while it's possible to hook up the drive to something like a CryoFlux controller, which is kind of pictured in that slide there, which bridges the gap between the old technology and the new technology, the reality is that as far as I know, there aren't similar devices for other kinds of drives, such as zip drives, SyQuest Easy drives, and so forth, that hook up to old-fashioned SCSI ports and require drivers that haven't been updated since Windows 98. So we're going to have to hold on to some old hardware just to get access to that stuff. It doesn't mean that all of us have to keep closets full of old junk, but some of us probably do. Including thoughts. So the great debate between emulation versus format migration versus standards or whatever seems to me to have been, kind of a red herring. Different classes of digital artifacts are very likely to require different kinds of handling. Different use cases have different requirements, and you can't really limit yourself to just one approach, scoped out in advance. Of course, it should be noted that both Rothenberg and Behrman were looking at preservation strategy from a big picture viewpoint in a broad theoretical best practices kind of way. And to be fair, they were scoping things out back before we had much practical experience to go on. I've been looking at the problem from pretty much exactly the opposite point of view, which is namely, what do we do with these boxes of floppy disks in the archives? So my findings don't exactly invalidate their arguments, but what they do, I think, provide is maybe some small insight into how the requirements of practice sometimes confound and sometimes complicate the requirements of theory. That's it. And we have... Thank you. 5 minutes for questions. All right. Nope. Anyone? The Spark Radio Museum in Coquitlam. If you ever get a chance to go, they're only open on Sunday afternoons. They're staffed by volunteers. It's a kind of like a cross between a museum and hoarders. It's ancient. It's on the grounds of the old Riverview Psychiatric Hospital, which is a psychiatric hospital that's been shut down, and it's a just metal warehouse building in the back of the grounds that's shared by the BC Ambulance on the other side of the, and it's stacked floor to ceiling with old radios, and they've got stuff that dates back to like the Titanic era and back when Vancouver Island was like a terminus for the trans Pacific submarine telegraph cable, stuff like that. It's if you love old tech, which I'm sure you do there, Caroline, then you really ought to check it out. It's a great spot to go, and they're just a great bunch of folks.
Hi, John.
Oh, hi, Lisa.
Hi. I'm wondering.
Hope you like the talk.
I'm wondering, is that stuff going to be in your office forever? No. What I'm wondering about is whether you would propose that libraries and archives should be trying to kind of collaboratively, in some way, collect and make available old hardware. What's the role for us in terms of having access to this hardware, and should we be doing it somehow together rather than everybody kind of storing things away
and storing it someplace other than my office? Is that what
that's
the subtext of this question?
Yeah,
I think it is something that some of us need to do. I think it's some level of expertise we do need to maintain. How much, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what's lurking in other people's archives. Right, this is stuff that I became aware of that was in our archives. A lot of the materials that I've been working with that we've been kind of collecting and putting in boxes over the years without a migration strategy for getting stuff off of the sort of more volatile media. Although you'd be surprised at how well 30-year-old floppy disks hold up if you store them in archivally appropriate conditions. But sooner or later, you've got to get the content off of them. So there is some question of how much of this material is out there, and that's something I've been kind of meaning to look at in terms of our own local archives just around the province of BC, but maybe further afield as well. I'd actually be quite curious to know if people want to talk to me after the presentation about how many of you are, archivists, how many of you know of stuff like this in your own institutions or organizations. That'd be good to know. Once we have a sense of what the need is, then I think we can probably determine a little bit better about how much of the stuff we need to keep, what kind, and so on. Right now, it's all being kept by volunteers. In fact, the BC Museum, the Provincial Museum, actually donates stuff to the Spark Radio Museum when, like their old radio gear, because they can't maintain it. It takes a certain level of expertise and a certain increasingly rare technical capabilities to keep this stuff running. Thank you.